Right, welcome everyone to this webinar, which acts as the official launch for Mustafa Menshawi's report entitled Sectarianism in Disguise, De-sectarianisation in Syria and Kuwait. Now, for those who haven't had the distinct pleasure of meeting Mustafa, well, firstly, you're missing out because he's a wonderful human being and a great scholar, but also Mustafa's been working with us on Project SEPAD as a postdoctoral fellow based at Lancaster University since last year. This report is related to the second phase of SEPAD, where we've been exploring some additional case studies, including Syria and Kuwait, which are the focus of Mustafa's report. And just at this juncture, I'd like to offer our thanks to Carnegie Corporation for all of their continued support for all of SEPAD's activities. Many thanks. So Simon and I have had the privilege of seeing this report develop over the last few months, and we're really proud to be able to launch it today and to celebrate Mustafa's excellent work. Joining us to reflect on the report's findings, we've had a slight change of lineup, so you're stuck with me as chair and Simon stepped in as one of our panelists. So we have firstly Dr. Courtney Freer and then obviously Professor Simon Mabon, who many of you know as well. So Dr. Freer is currently the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at Emory College, having previously served as Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at the Middle East Centre at LSE, and she is the author of Rentier Islamism, The Influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gulf Monarchies, published with Oxford University Press. Professor Mabon is Chair in International Politics at Lancaster University, where he's also Director of the Richardson Institute, and of course the Director of SEPAD, and is the author of, well, frankly, too many things to mention here, but we should, of course, give a shout out to your most recent monograph, Simon, Houses Built on Sand, with Manchester University Press. And last but not least, the main event, Dr. Mustafa Menshawi, currently a postdoctoral research fellow with SEPAD at Lancaster University. Mustafa's most recent monograph, Leaving the Muslim Brotherhood, Self-Society and the State, was published with Palgrave in 2020, and it's just one of many exciting and innovative outputs that he has produced, and we've had the pleasure of having first-hand view of. So, format-wise, Mustafa, if you kick us off, up to 10 minutes, and then we'll invite Courtney and Simon to offer their own reflections before a Q&A. For those in attendance, feel free to place your questions in the questions box, and we'll endeavour to pose them to Mustafa as well. Okay, so Mustafa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wastonich. It's very kind, and just it's my pleasure being part of SEPAD over the past year. I think I'm one of the only few persons who is not very happy to leave their postdoc for a permanent position when it comes for a reason. I love SEPAD. It's a great experience, and I have been taken care of. The mentorship is second to none. And I think I hope I'm not very sycophantic of that, but it's a great experience. The report is outcome, not just we had discussions, Edward and Simon all the time, over Iranian pizza, which is as good as the Italian pizza in the Lancaster campus. So it's a great experience. It comes out of our discussion. Thanks to Professor Freer for being here, and Professor Mabon as well. I find it hard actually to start the titles with the prefixes, given the informality of our discussion at SEPAD. But it's great having Courtney because the expert when it comes to the Gulf, Kuwait, is a great insight into the report. I'm looking forward to her comments. And Simon doesn't need the introduction of that. So it's my pleasure just having you, as my plan is actually to take the report into a kind of a new territory, which is more expansive as such. Okay. I'm going to explain myself and the whole report in a kind of a few minutes. The whole point is actually to keep it as a curtain raiser, whetting your appetite for what comes next. The report should come up tomorrow or so, if I got correctly from Elias, the great Elias, who's actually behind the screen helping out with the production of the report. Big thank you to him as well. So, okay, the report is as simple as such. It's about a conundrum, a contradiction in Arab politics, which is if you travel to any Arab country as sectarian, like Syria, completely engulfed with sectarian tendencies, identity, the whole legitimacy of the regime is based on this kind of sectarian identification with who you are. But the reality is, if you ask them, are you sectarian? The answer is completely not. So I'm dealing with this case of acting as if not, as Lisa Woodin put it in 1998. But the whole point, just I'm taking into sectarianism, asking the question why and how the Arab leaders are denying, hiding, falsifying sectarianism in the name of de-sectarianization. This is the first argument that I make. The second argument, which is comes to the sample, includes Syria and Kuwait. And I think a lot of people are actually could be not very supportive of this comparison, because Kuwait is taken as Courtney is making references in her writings, insightful as they are, that Kuwait is being sold as a success story when it comes to sectarianism, bringing this kind of social harmony, faultless unity when it comes to relations between Sunnis and Shiites as the classical exemplifiers of the sectarianization process. So what is my argument in the report? That the Syria and Kuwait are not far from each other when it comes to the case of acting, treating just de-sectarianization as another face of sectarianism. That leads me to the third point of what I'm mentioning in the report, which is a definition as basic as what is sectarianism in the first place. I bet just it's very confusing, sadly, despite the mass corpus of literature on sectarianism burgeoning as it comes in the past few years. I have to blame Simon Maiden for that. It's the literature is actually still, the term is very elusive and confusing and just nebulous. You cannot actually have a specific definition of sectarianism. I treat sectarianism as what Simon mentioned in one of his articles, the National Review. It's as a boundary making. It's a process, as Hashimi and just mentioned in the article, that sectarianism is a process. What Simon put at it's a becoming different case. And that means actually it's a process of boundary making or othering or becoming different. That means two important conclusions. It's not necessarily about religion, and it takes out from the Sunnis, Shias. It's all the cases of othering in one way or another, in which religion is employed as a mobilizer for this kind of polarization that comes across. And why this definition, the second element, why this definition is important, because it's expansive enough to make the argument that if it's the sectarianism is not about being Sunni or Shia, that means actually nationalism, secularism, or any other ideologies can be included in our the space in which we define or actually try to situate sectarianism as such. And how do I prove the three elements that I just mentioned? I made a discourse analysis. Welcome to another elusive concept. What is discourse? And I hope that I will not spend the 24 hours, the coming 24 hours, defining what is discourse. So this come with the simple definition, which is discourse is about meaning making, which is done for a specific purpose at a specific time. It's a bit synthetic approach to discourse because it's Foucauldian in a way, because it's about power relations. Who has power would impose his or her own discourse on others. So it has about a bit of ideology in it. And Althusserien, the new Marxist ideological part, which is actually dealing with discourse as a strategy for control, legitimation, or survival as well. It has a bit of post-structuralism as well, Chantal Mouffe's argument, which is actually one of the key arguments that come across theoretical framework underpinning what my analysis is. And it's a bit Hegelian analysis in which the argument is that the relation between concepts as sectarianism and de-sectarianization they are not opposite poles. They're actually related in a way by opposition. It's a bit structuralist in the way that the sense we have to look at opposite elements or opposite concepts as complementing each other. In that sense, actually, there is a sense of dialogicality between the sectarianism and de-sectarianization as well. So yeah, this is how I take discourse as is. So it has a bit looking beyond texts as discursive processes, as well as the political processes that are behind it. So I analyzed the speeches of Bashar al-Assad and since 2011, and the speeches of Sabah al-Ahmed, who died in 2020, in order to look for specific elements, how they approach sectarianism, what kind of elements, and de-sectarianization as well. So, for example, I found 3 key themes. The first one is unity, national unity, which is repeated again and again. And within this unification, the word sectarianism is denied a discursive field or space. Another point, as Chantal Mouffe and Ernest Laclau would call it, in order to rise and come up. So ironically enough, the unity discourse, which is meant to bring the Syrians or Kuwaitis together, underpinning all elements in which any mention of sectarianism are eclipsed or downsized. So if I put it as simply, for my simple-mindedness, is shush, don't speak about sectarianism, because actually we are de-sectarianizing. But the de-sectarianizing act is, as Al-Hajj Saleh calls it, this kind of sectarian chastity is being preserved and maintained in the name of de-sectarianization. But this de-sectarianization, if I confuse you enough, is an act of sectarianization as well, because any voices which is actually trying to approach that issue would be shushed off. Actually, just they were never given a space. The second element is the classical element, externalization. Sectarianism is an external import, and it's not internal, and this is actually built up on the first element of unity. Why this is important? Because that means actually it means ideal politics of de-sectarianization. The Syrian society, Syrian politics are completely ideal enough in order not to have any sectarian tendencies. And I trace that in the speeches of Assad, for example, in which he's all the time mentioning the salvational, redemptive element of de-sectarianization, saying what is a great element of the conflict after 2011 is that it allows people who have any kind of inklings or doubts about the sectarianization to come out, and they are purified, they are de-sectarianized completely as they are. So my argument here is that the externalization element, a difference that I found between the Syrian case and the Kuwaiti case is very interesting, and it's contextual, while Assad is very loud and clear about naming the external elements, the Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States, or the classical empire, as he used it in generalistic sense. When it comes to the Kuwait, it's all the time vague and ambiguous. And I try to relate that to the internal politics or the state formation of Kuwait, in which they have to do this kind of balance with those bloody powerful neighbors around them, namely Iraq, the Iran, and just the Saudi Arabia, of course. So there's a bit of difference in which the Amir never mentions specific actors. He all the time saying foreign export without kind of detailing it. So I'll try to relate that to the context as well. Final point, because I promised to be 7 minutes, I hope that I'm not just going beyond. I would love to hear the comments of the panelists, Simon and Courtney, on that. But the final point is actually, it's step one, that project is report is coming into shape as published, but I'm looking forward to building that. But if there's any kind of a takeaway of my report that I would actually claim about my findings, is the systematicity of it. That means actually I analyze the discourse in a very meticulous, systematic way in order to find the thematic construction that I came across and linking them within the context. So actually they are not a one-off. It's a process in the sense that it's temporal by following the speech after speech, including all those of Assad and all those of the Kuwaiti Emir as well. So thanks so much for listening to me. I'm more than welcome for suggestions. Feel free to cut me to pieces. I'm more than happy. I have a thicker skin, by the way, so just please don't worry about that. So just yeah. Thanks so much for that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mustafa. Great stuff. Okay, so if we can go straight to our panelist, Courtney, if we can come to you first, and then we'll go to Simon next.
So thank you so much. I had the privilege of reading the report yesterday or this weekend. I really enjoyed it, and so I'm not going to tear you apart. I found your themes of unification and externalization in the rhetoric of these leaders really compelling. So more than kind of, giving a ton of criticism, I wanted to add to how I see those themes having developed in Kuwait. And I'd say particularly since 2015. So on the theme of unification, I think that a turning point in Kuwait was really in June 2015, after a bombing at Imam Sadiq Mosque, which is a Shia mosque in Kuwait City, claimed by ISIS, killed 27 people, wounded over 200 people. I mean, I think after that, we see a very self-conscious reiteration of Kuwaiti unification on behalf of the regime, meaning the ruling family, meaning the emir, but also on behalf of politicians in general. This idea that the Kuwaiti national identity subsumes all sects, and therefore we all need to come together in the face of this type of violence. And so I really do see that as a turning point in terms of rhetoric. Another thing that I think we see after that time is this conflation of de-sectarianization with fighting terrorism, and kind of the opposite. So sectarianization is associated with terrorism. And I think that was probably more the case when ISIS was, more active in terms of propagating these types of attacks. But I found that kind of interesting that you do see that kind of alignment after the attack in 2015 in Kuwait. And I also think that the theme of unification is particular to Kuwait, not only when it comes to sectarian divisions, but also political divisions in general. I mean, the Kuwaiti parliament is, notably fractious, notably, vocal, to such an extent that we had the cabinet resign just last week for I forget how many times it's been now, maybe 3 times in a year or 2 years, something like this. So you have a lot of, political divisions inside of Kuwait, and they don't always necessarily fall along sectarian lines. As you mentioned, Kuwait is usually identified as a sectarian success story, and I think that in some ways this is true because largely because there are so many other political cleavages, right? So there are the cleavages between the urban Hadar Kuwaitis and then the tribal Kuwaitis. There's opposition versus loyalists. There's Islamist, non-Islamist. So there are a lot of different cleavages as well. So I think, again, this rhetoric of unification is something that we see not just when it comes to sectarian divisions, but to other divisions in Kuwait as well. And I think Kuwait is somewhat unique in this emphasis on we need to work together for the sake of the country rather than focusing on individual political, sect, tribal identities. And then on the second theme about externalization, I was also thinking, about when I saw this shift in Kuwait. And I remember being in Kuwait in 2015, and there was a lot of concern about Iraqi Shia militias basically coming into Kuwait. So there was a lot of concern about, like you mentioned, that these unruly neighbors will somehow disrupt the stability that Kuwait knows. And in 2015, the discovery of the Abdali cell really shook Kuwait in terms of really awakening ideas that there was an external threat posed by Shia groups. So the Abdali cell in 2015 was discovered. Kuwaiti authorities basically found a huge weapons cache in Abdali, which is near the Iraqi border. And this led to the arrest of several Kuwaiti Shias, as well as, I believe, one Iranian as well. And during this time, the trial related to the Abdali cell, speculation as to what the Abdali cell was doing in Kuwait really ran rampant. And it really did show, again, this theme of externalization, that Kuwait in and of itself doesn't have sectarian problems, but neighbors have a vested interest in bringing it in. And I remember like all of these rumors as to how the weapons arrived in Kuwait. There was one rumor that they were dropped at the bottom of the sea, and then people would go out and get, the Iranians dropped these weapons in the sea, and then people went and brought them to Abdali. Like all of these rumors about ways in which outside actors were trying to destabilize sectarian stability, right, basically in Kuwait. And we saw this again at the end of last year. There was another case about 25 Kuwaiti Shias who were arrested, and one Iranian arrested for spying for Iran and for Hezbollah. Interestingly, this case came up around the same time that Kuwait cut off its diplomatic ties with Lebanon after the remarks of the information minister about the Yemen war. And interestingly, most of these the accused have been released since the start of this case. But again, it brought up this language that we'd seen in 2015 with the Abdali cell about the dangers of neighbors, essentially, of neighbors getting involved in Kuwaiti affairs, stirring up sectarian divisions. So I really think that you've touched on some themes that I see a lot in Kuwait. So I really enjoyed that. One question I did kind of want to push you on, and then I'll stop, is at the end of the report, you talk about the potential for political leaderships to be political entrepreneurs, essentially, in their use of de-sectarian language and de-sectarianization. And I wonder, I mean, are they political entrepreneurs, or are they guardians of the status quo? I mean, are they actually just trying to keep things the way they are so that they can reliably stay in power? I don't know if that's too cynical of a reading, but that was one question that came to my mind. But overall, I really enjoyed it. So well done. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Courtney. Great insight there as ever. Mustafa, did you want to come back on that question, or did you want to have Simon's comments first and then take them in the round? So it's entirely up to you.
It's up to you. You're the chairman.
I'm trying to be a benevolent chair.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let's take Simon's then, and then we'll come back to that. But yeah, thanks so much, Courtney. It's great to give those sort of examples of some of that stuff that speaks to a lot of the discourses that Mustafa's talking about. Was really interesting as well. So Simon, over to you, and then we'll take some questions. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Eddie. I will begin with an apology and say I'm sorry that I'm not Adham Saoli. Sadly, he's had a personal crisis, so unfortunately you're stuck with me. I will not be as erudite as Adham normally is, certainly not as stylish, but I will do my best to offer some type of reflections on this report. It's been really interesting watching Mustafa work through this, and Eddie and I have had many a conversation with him about these questions and ideas of belonging and sectarianism, and how it relates to some of his previous work with the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's been really fascinating to go with you, Mustafa, on this intellectual journey. So I should start by saying thank you and congratulations. It's been really, really rich to listen to you, hear you thinking through these ideas. So I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the report will get the credit that it deserves, because it raises so many important and interesting observations about Syria, about Kuwait, about sectarianism, about de-sectarianization, and much more. So very well done. I think I want to start with picking up on the point that Courtney's just made about sectarian entrepreneurs or political elites and entrepreneurs who are using de-sectarianization. And the question that comes to mind then is de-sectarianization can be viewed in many different ways. And we have a special issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs that looks at this. Morten Valbjørn did a wonderful article reflecting on some of the normative assumptions about desectarianization. But leaving those normative assumptions aside, I think there's typically an assumption that desectarianization is a revolutionary process. It's a process about dramatically transforming something. And Courtney's just put it about status quo, but I wonder if it's conservative. Is this idea of desectarianization a fundamentally conservative process? Because if you look at both of your two case studies, you see elites wanting to maintain power, wanting to keep the status quo, regardless of the social dynamics and some of the language. And in the Syrian case, regardless of having previously engaged in processes of sectarianization. And so in the Syrian case, it strikes me there's maybe a point that sectarianization is the more revolutionary and desectarianization is a more conservative process, given that it's concerned with maintaining the power of the Assad regime. So I think what this report does is it shakes up a number of those preconceived assumptions about what it is that we're dealing with here. And I like the approach that you've got to sectarianism. I think it's perhaps a little provocative, and there'll be some people who might disagree with it, thinking that it's a bit too broad. But I like this idea of boundary making and this deviation from a collective imaginary, because I think it allows us to reflect on different component parts of sectarian difference and the interplay between discourse, politics, society, space, and boundary making. And conversely, I think that comes out really nicely in questions of desectarianization and this apparent return to a collective identity, or perhaps put better, a collective imaginary. Particularly in the Syrian case, it's hard to think of a time, particularly in its recent past, where there has been this collective unity without serious communal tensions between the different groups. And the report points to some of these moments, these historical moments, such as the Hammam massacre, the legacy of the Muslim Brotherhood, tensions between the Islamists and the Baathists. And that dates back 4 decades now. So this idea of returning to a collective memory or a collective unity, I think is quite problematic. It is more of a collective imaginary. And this is not to take issue with what it is that you're saying exactly, but to maybe add on an additional component to it, that we're dealing with imagined communities. We're dealing with imagined collectives, which maybe further complicates things. But if we're dealing with questions of desectarianization, much like, as you say in the report, sectarianism is pretty ambiguous. As Morten Valbjørn has said, a second name check for Morten today, it's verging on an essentially contested concept. Desectarianization is equally contested. And this special issue that we did in the past raised a number of questions about what desectarianization is, what it tries to do, where it takes place, who is involved in it, how they operate, what those people involved in processes of desectarianization are actually seeking to achieve. And there are so many parallels here between processes of sectarianization, in that there are elites, often elites, engaging in process that seeks to achieve more conservative goals. And I think at that point of process is really important in what it is that you're doing here. The process of discourse, the process of an ongoing set of discourses and imaginations and reimagining of the role of religion. But it's done with a conservative mindset, and it's done by people in positions of power, which goes against some of the commonly held assumptions about desectarianization. And by that, I'm thinking immediately of the Lebanese protests in 2019, the Tishreen protests in Iraq. They are typically held as being de-sectarianizing protests, social movements seeking to reject the sectarian system. And here you've got two completely different types of de-sectarianization that go away from the sort of the quintessential the quintessential social movement process. So in that sense, I think there's really interesting material that comes out of this report, conceptually as well as empirically. And again, that those themes of unification and externalization that you flag up in the Kuwaiti case are fascinating with regard to the Syrian case. And understanding the interplay between actors on the inside and actors on the outside, I think reveals a great deal about the Assad regime and about Syrian politics. And in particular, I'm thinking of this discussion of pan-Arabism, which is fascinating. And obviously pan-Arabism has a really prominent role to play in the Syrian state, but that interplay between pan-Arabism and de-sectarianization, both of which are discourses that refer to imagined collective identities that seek to homogenize and gloss over different forms of identification, are really fascinating. Given that both seem to be suppressing practical differences in support of a broader collective. So you talk about national unity, integrity, and consensus, but yet those very processes of pan-Arabism and de-sectarianization are drawing boundaries by rejecting all other forms of identity, or prioritizing, privileging particular identity forms over others. So in that sense, I think it's a really interesting report that raises so many important questions. And the methodology that you've used, of course, is equally impressive, going through all these different speeches. It is a very rigorous discourse analysis based on primary sources, speeches given by leaders over a long period of time. It's incredibly thorough, incredibly impressive. And I guess it raises important questions about discourse as well. And there's this really interesting section on conspiracies in the Syrian part, and the ways in which Assad has tried to cultivate this sort of conspiracy of external manipulation and the conspiracy of Western nefarious activity to cultivate sectarian difference. And if I can just quote a couple of lines here, there's this sense of trying to maintain our success and protect ourselves against any conspiracy which might be hatched against us in the outside world, knowing that, and I quote again, Syria is facing a great conspiracy. So there's this sense that the West is using the West is seeking to manipulate sectarian difference to justify interfering in Syrian affairs. And yet we look closer at what happened in Syria post-2011. It's the opposite, of course. So again, there's contradiction and this real sort of tension between the rhetoric and the actions, and this is really fascinating when it comes out in the Syrian case. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood's role has a really this form of Sunni sectarianism, as you talk about, which provides the regime with the perfect alibi to crush discussion on sectarianism, and that it does so, as you say, in the name of its alleged status as a de-sectarianization keeper. So here you have sort of conservative, authoritarian tactics that fall within the broad rubric of de-sectarianization. So again, there's that contradiction with what is typically associated as being a de-sectarianizing moment. So I think it's really fascinating intellectually and empirically, and I'm really, really excited for people to get a chance to read it and engage with it, because there's so much in here, from the real empirical discourse analysis of two leaders that are diametrically different, or seem to be diametrically different, and yet what the report does is show, well, actually there's a lot of similarities at play here. So I think it's great. I'm really delighted that it's out, and it will be out, and I think it's going to kickstart some more really interesting conversations around sectarianism around de-sectarianisation, and really push further into this path that you're on with regard to the role of discourse. So thank you, Mustafa. It's great, and I'm really, really delighted that it's out.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Simon. Okay, so we have just over 20 minutes left. Just participants who are watching, feel free to use the Q&A box to pop your questions in, and I shall relay them to Mustafa. Mustafa, did you want to come to Courtney's initial observation about political entrepreneurship? If indeed you have an answer to that.
Yeah.
At least
I'll try to make up an answer. That's great. Yeah, I don't know the answer. Yeah, freaking out. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point, Courtney. I think it sounds like a double identity. It's they are entrepreneurs and at the same time status quo keeper in the same sense, because I think it's important to think of leadership from the symbolic politics of what Edelman calls it. It's about the image, the perception. Just as Newstat mentions that to be about the American presidency, it's all about the how he looks rather than what he do. So I think if we think of it that way, I think the perception that leader as authoritarian, as the two examples that we have, is that we are democratic, we are good, by the sake on the basis of defending the de-sectarianized idealistic position which is in our countries. But in reality, the sectarian policies, which actually completely entrenched, and the two leaders may depend on them for their own survival and legitimation, are actually being eclipsed for that purpose. So it's kind of the two cases in one. It's a bit of contradiction or a puzzle or just I don't know a positional case that comes across playing the two roles at the two roles at the same time. And it's amazing how, especially in the case of Syria, where the rise of the regime and the maintenance of it completely depend on the Alawite, support and identity politics in which they gain their position as such. But at the same time, they deny this positionality as Alawite-based regime by claiming or propagating that we are not sectarian, we are completely just defending the de-sectarianization position. So actually, within this kind of position, it comes the kind of the acting as if not a position. The two more points which are actually mentioned by Simon as well, if I'll be quick. The first one is actually what all the literature on de-sectarianization, including the one by Edward Westonich, who's not here. So just he wrote an article with Samira Nazirzada in the same issue about review of faith and international affairs, and they think of de-sectarianization as an idea, a potentiality, a possibility, which is not there in reality. My argument is completely the opposite. De-sectarianization is a reality as constructed as it is. It's on the ground. It's actually taking shape within the sectarian perspective as such. The second element, which is actually I hope it adds up, that literature all the time dominated by religion and the Sunni Saudi pivotal position, as actually these are the two key factors that push the Sunnis and Shiites being in rivalry over what history, religion, whatever it is. My argument within this process, it's not about religion, it's about the process of constructing an othering, in which religion is just one factor, because the report is actually treating that, ironically enough, well, if you want to make things complicated, is secularism and religion actually are playing the same role of establishing just elements when it comes to the sectarianization element that comes across. And I think that, Courtney, what you mentioned about being entrepreneurs and the status quo keeper is very clear in the Kuwaiti case when it comes to internal tension inside the ruling family, when Al-Salim and Al-Jabr just gets into argument just against each other, and in that case, then unification discourse comes in to keep things quiet, and you have to keep thinking of the Shia element as and the Sunni one as actually they have their own supporters among those two sectarian positions as well. So yeah, but your point, Courtney, about the process and points of rupture, rather than thinking of it as a kind of a pattern, continuous, I think this is what is missing in the report, and it's a great discussion actually to build in, and perhaps my second report or further writings to come. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Great, thank you, Mustafa. Yeah, I think that point on this kind of broader conceptualization of what de-sectarianism and sectarianism can be conceived as, I think that's really important, and it speaks to that point Courtney was saying, I think, as well, about this de-sectarianizing tendency was brought up in relation to fighting terrorism, for example. So there you have it, you pick this kind of issue that it isn't necessarily, well, I mean, in some cases obviously it's religiously ordained, but I mean, really, you are looking at extrapolating it to wider issue areas, which I think is really important. And thanks for the name check as well, that's very kind of you.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to, yeah, if anyone wanted to, yeah, please do.
Just on that point about fighting terrorism, there's an interesting point here about the Assad regime framing the protests under this banner of the war on terror, right? That the 2011 protests and the response were framed as a need to fight the war on terror as part of the sort of the struggle against Sunni Islamists. But this was this sort of sectarian component of fighting against Sunni Islamists that went on to be Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. They were released from Assad's prisons. So simultaneously, and this is one of the real points of tension and contradiction that I think you flag up, Mustafa, you've got the Assad sectarianizing to justify repression, and then de-sectarianizing in order to try and cultivate this sense of collective identity, because pushing that sectarian card too far risks fracturing the state. So aside from it just being sort of sectarianizing or de-sectarianizing, in the Syrian case, you've actually got this sort of intertwined, complex interplay of two different things at the same time. Sorry, just a thought.
Thanks, Mustafa, do you want to come back on that, or Courtney?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Simon. I think it's totally agree with that you described it as contradictions in the Hegelian sense of actually having the two elements together actually to build up the whole image and picture. And I think this is one interesting element to look at de-sectarianization as sectarianization, as Courtney mentioned as well, not only as a pattern of similarities and repetition, but as rupture as well. It's the bloody dictators that are humans after all, and just they're not necessarily following a systematic line of policies or action. The Assad case is very clear as well, and perhaps actually the Kuwaiti case, if actually very interested in going back into articles and newspapers, how they went through stages, as Courtney mentioned. And it's very interesting to find the sectarian overtones keeps coming up at certain occasions and goes down in a certain in other occasions. So it's not necessarily about black and white. It's getting blurry and just within this kind of blurry position that sectarianization and de-sectarianization can come across. And what's really amazing about what you say, Simon, and what Courtney mentioned as well, is that we're not speaking about sectarianism. We're not speaking about ism here. We're speaking about process actually changing and moving forward, and actually try to situate it, fixate it within the Saudi-Iranian rivalry or the Shia-Sunni by what's happening almost 1,000 years. It's a bit unfair and completely undated as well, because things are changing and moving, and it's at just sectarianism is a process in motion, taking different shapes all the time. It's more like a chameleon, I would say. It's yeah, we cannot get hold of it because it's in the process, I would say. Yeah.
And if I can jump in, I think that
Nice.
also makes it possible for these rulers to be both political entrepreneurs and guardians of the status quo, depending on where you are in the process, what's happening, how sectarianisation or de-sectarianization are viewed, because it's not status quo in and of itself. It's not like a process that's finished. So I think that kind of adds to the theoretical underpinnings of looking at these actors as entrepreneurs, because they are kind of forced to be.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, no one use, none of these actors use the term we are de-sectarianizing, do they? Or the opposite, in fact, do they? This is kind of extrapolated in a sense, but yeah, I mean, we can obviously see elements of that, but I think that's why we have to problematize this notion, and as you say and stuff, those kind of more reductive analyses that tend to funnel it through those kind of say Iran, Saudi, or Sunni. I think we need to sort of go beyond that. Weeds coming in, so thank you very much. First one, I'm just going to go with Javier's first, because
we lost Eddie. We've lost Eddie. So there was a long question in the chat from Javier. Javier says, I'm struggling a bit to endorse the sectarianization through de-sectarianization relationship solely analyzing discourse. If we approach sectarianization/de-sectarianization as not necessarily good or bad in and of itself, the same could be said of securitization and desecuritization, then de-sectarianization could be framed as a process of displacing one category of practice, brackets sectarian identity, for other. For example, nationalism is dominant in politics. I agree with the point of displacing one category for another while reproducing who stays in power, but would not de-sectarianization be taking place in any case? That one's for you, Mustafa. And I'm glad it's not for me.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an answer without sounding silly.
But while you're thinking, Mustafa, I'll just say that we've managed to get the report up early, and I will put a link in the chat to everyone who should be able to download the report from the CEPAD website right now. So I'm really pleased we could get that resolved, and the link is in the chat.
Thanks so much. That sounds like flashing breaking news. So everyone is taking notes now.
Well, it's mostly to buy you a few seconds just to think of your answer.
Okay, that's great. Okay, perfect. Okay, if you put out such, yeah, I think, Javier, thanks so much for your question. I'm not quite sure if I grasp what is exactly the key question, but I think that your insight about the conflation between nationalism and sectarianism and how the two ideologies are actually related to each other with the sectarianization process is very interesting. And what you mentioned actually about the displacement of certain idea for another, and this process of hiding, it's very interesting as well, because it's how power relations dominance is putting one concept forward and another concept backwards. And this is why discourse analysis could be interesting, because it's about throwing into salience a specific idea and not another. And I'll be very honest, I think that it's the first step in a 1,000-mile journey, and I think what I'm trying to do in the report could be it could be a simple way of answering a simple question. I will put as such. The point is actually thinking of de-sectarianization as a process, in the sense that it takes different shapes. This is what I'm trying to prove here. But I think perhaps actually it's great that Simon is here. Perhaps further research about the relationship. I'm not quite sure if there's a bit of literature that the relationship between nationalism and sectarianism and how they intermingle or actually being used and misused as such could be very important. important element as well to dig further into that. I did a bit of that in the report, looking about nationalism as an imaginary concept. It's actually, and in which actually sectarianism and de-sectarianization are other imaginaries as well, because actually it's imagining being part of a group, which could not necessarily just true, or you know each other the same way Benedict Anderson would argue for. And the same process in sectarianism, where you think of Shias as one category, one group, imagine including the Shias in Iran exactly like the Shias in Bahrain. The same applies to nationalism as well. So I'm trying to find that kind of the linkage that come across. I'm not quite sure if I answer your question, Fatia, but I'm more than happy to be invited for a cappuccino in the campus of Lancaster, and we can discuss that.
Thank you. Sorry, I got booted out then just in the middle of reading that out. I'm sure someone stepped in for me though. There was another question which has now disappeared because I've had to rejoin from an attendee in Islamabad. I don't know if I can't view it anymore, Simon. I don't know if you can see that in the Q&A, can you?
Yeah, I've got it here. So the question is, why is Pakistan and sectarian polemics missing from contemporary academia, which is mostly focused on the Middle East? And why is the field of sectarianism still waiting for a concrete theory to come?
Thank you.
I think I'm not the expert when it comes to Pakistan, so I'm sorry, forgive my ignorance of that. So, but I'll just, yeah, it's a very interesting area of taking the case beyond the Middle East, and it's completely unfair. The Middle East is dominating for a reason, so it's unfair. But I think the question is actually why. I think sectarianism is actually it's a growing field. Well, some will call it a subfield, but it's actually very multidisciplinary as well. And one way of identifying it as othering or boundary making is actually to move across disciplines. But sadly, I think it's unfair. This is my personal view. I think that sectarianism is disadvantaged, or actually got in a weaker position, because it's geopolitically driven by the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. I think because, the money part comes here. Actually, I think that every attention is coming across to what's happening between the Saudi Arabia and Iran, or Shias and Sunnis as the religious underpinning of what's happening politically, is actually driving all other elements out. And that is a problem, because it comes into a primordialist position, which is actually supported by Vali Nasr, and those are all interesting chaps who argue that the only way to understand what's happening now is to go back a century ago. And that is problematic, because it fixates the movability of the sectarianization process to a single event that happened in the past. And sadly, colonialism is not helping out, because some of the arguments, like Mr. Obama is mentioning, it's all about this kind of it's about the past. The colonial carve up, if you like, is holding this kind of understanding forward. So the vitality of the subfield, if you like, of sectarianism is being held hostage by this geopolitically clientelists, whatever you call it, the just picture-oriented, sadly enough, into the Sunni Shiites Iranian perspective. And yeah, this is I find it's highly politicized field when it comes to such. It's personal, but yeah.
Great answer. Thank you, Mustafa. Hard to disagree with a lot of that as well.
Eddie, can I just ask a quick question to Mustafa?
Please.
Just on the back of that, please, because what you've said just there is sort of trying to reduce the sort of sectarian discussions to geopolitics, and I can understand completely why you would do that, although maybe there's a bit more nuance. But to what extent is de-sectarianization about religion then? Because the report points to the political goals of de-sectarianizing actors. But if they're political goals that are using manipulating communal difference that is religious, to what extent are we dealing in politics? Or is it more about religion, or is it about politically charged religion or religiously charged politics?
I think this is a $1 million question on them. I think I need to sleep on it, because it's very intriguing, because part of my argument is that religion is a minor element in the sectarianization and de-sectarianization process. But if my argument is such, that means actually every element would fit, and sectarianism and de-sectarianization would lose its unique positionality, which is based on the religious element, or just i.e. the Sunni, Shia, whatever it comes across. That means actually sectarianism would be another face of nationalism or secularism that comes across. So it loses its own identity as a kind of becoming an other on the basis of that. However, I think the interesting element that we come across, as Peter Berger in The Sacred Canopy would argue, it's about the dynamics of dominance and resistance, rather than actually about entities as fixated as religion. So we think of religion as a process of imposing the dominant worldview or norms. I'm getting into your territory here, Simon. So it's about imposing a specific worldview on others while actually ignoring other points of view. So I'm thinking of the process, dynamics of power dynamics, power relations, and ideological positionality to impose one version of truth against others, rather than religion as a fixed element. So if I think of it from the sociology of religion, I'm more into the functionalist element of religion as serving a specific purpose, rather than actually rather than actually being fixated into a specific shape for a specific purpose, as textualists would argue for. I hope I answered your question, but it's very, very interesting area that I need to dig further as well about the religiosity of the politicized elements of sectarianism as such. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Mustafa. Okay, we're fast running out of time. We did have a final question I saw come through from our good friend Iyad. If you can answer that very broad question in 1 minute, Mustafa, on whether the systemic process of othering should be necessarily a sectarian or non-sectarian, then you get a very special prize. The piece is on me next time.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Can you see the question? So Iyad asks, should the systematic process of othering be necessarily sectarian or non-sectarian?
Okay. Sorry, say that again. Sorry,
should the process of othering be sectarian or non-sectarian, basically?
I think this is very interesting. If I answer that in one element, I think every process of othering includes a sort of the othering as well. That sounds a bit confusing, but just Chantal Moufreau, a great book about and actually it's Hegel's position as well, that we have to look at concepts as opposites. They could be different, but they are actually equivalent in one sense, because if we think of the purpose of actually establishing a status quo, that means actually othering and de-othering all the time working together, especially as authoritarianism is a dynamic process. If you have a bloody leader spending 20 or 30 or 40 years in power, probably he's not actually specific about a specific way of looking at othering. It always works within the dynamic of othering and de-othering as well, in order for to stay in power, as simple as such. Yeah.
Brilliantly done. Excellent. Okay, well, all that's left for me to say is just to thank you all for coming, and thank you to our guests, Courtney, Simon, Mustafa, of course. The report will be available, Simon, tomorrow, shortly.
It's live now.
It's live now. Okay.
That's what you missed when you were kicked out.
Oh, yeah.
Damn,
we did that on purpose. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, do engage with it, and Mustafa, I'm sure, will be happy to receive any queries on the report and further questions out the confines of this meeting. But thanks again, everyone. It's been really great, and congratulations again, Mustafa. Great to see you all.